work, trying to give the truth a fighting chance on mainstream media, but I am feeling scared. And that is a weird thing to say out loud, but I am. I'm scared of a lot of things right now, and that is not a natural instinct for me. I am scared that I won't be able to afford my health insurance going forward, and I'm going to have to die of a disease I have survived for 17 years because my government doesn't see me or people like me as worth keeping alive. I'm scared that even if we rearrange everything to afford our health insurance, I'm going to lose access to my medication because it has to be delivered monthly and the government is interfering with the mail and tariffing everything. So my medication continuing to arrive is not a guarantee. I'm scared that we're going to lose all the money we have been able to save over years and years when the government tanks the market or the US dollar, and we won't be able to afford our rent, let alone my father's care or my son's college, which he is supposed to start in the fall. I am watching the world order rearrange. And I am legitimately terrified that my beautiful 18-year-old son will be drafted into some unjust war to make oil executives and billionaires richer at the expense of our children's lives. And I am scared of NSPM 7, the directive that AG Pam Bondi issued on December 4th that most people missed. The main message of this presidential memorandum was that federal law enforcement will begin to target individuals, organizations, and people who fund anyone the Trump Department of Justice believes is a domestic terrorist. And they define domestic terrorism very broadly. Apparently, it is now domestic terrorism to dox anyone in law enforcement, to make any effort to get in the way of immigration enforcement. That seems to include even filming ICE officers if they are illegally brutalizing people. This memo says the person filming would be the criminal, not the ICE officers. You can be labeled a domestic terrorist for targeting a public official or other political actors, despite the fact the Republican Party is perpetually calling for violence against politicians. Our president himself retweeted that Democrats should be hung for their video reminding the military not to follow illegal orders. This memo singles out anyone who is aligned with Antifa, so anyone who is publicly against fascism, as well as those who adhere to extreme viewpoints on immigration, or radical gender ideology, or anti-American sentiment, which is defined to include anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, and anti-traditional family values. And that scares me because that's a lot of us. And the AG has instructed the FBI to establish a tip line and a cash reward system for anyone whose information leads to the successful identification and arrest of individuals in the leadership of domestic terrorist organizations. How does that not include the people who run the ACLU, or Indivisible, or Planned Parenthood, or any LGBTQ organization? How does that not include any pro-democracy legal teams, or left-wing creators, or any journalist who just reports facts the government doesn't like? How does that not include me? This country is becoming more and more unrecognizable to me every day, and that scares me. And I don't understand where the people who are supposed to protect us or our rights and our values have gone. I am genuinely scared. But I am also incredibly angry. And I just hope I am not alone in that.
All right, everyone, welcome to another edition of Politics by Jake. And that's I'm Jake, Politics by Jake, and that is a colleague of mine, and her name is Leigh McGowan. And she's been doing this since about 2015, which I thought was interesting when I looked up the bio information on her. And she goes by the name on the internet, Politics Girl, and you can check her out. She's got a lot of videos. She's got more than I do on YouTube at Politics Girl. That's like me. I'm at Politics by Jake. She's at Politics Girl. And she's incredibly angry, and I'm incredibly angry too. And we're going to be talking about, and that's the whole idea of Politics by Jake, is to talk about these things. But, you have recently a New York Times interview, and there's so much going on. I have begun to say this, but have always said it since I've been doing this show, periodically, that there's so much going on that you just can't cover it all. It's just too hard to cover it all. But we had a New York Times interview recently, just very recently, the last couple of days, and it never quits with him. Trump is now talking about, and his cabal, Stephen Miller, but not only Stephen Miller, talking about invading Greenland, talking about going to war with Denmark, just extraordinary things. And in this New York Times interview, he was asked, and once again, this is just a few days ago. They'll probably put it in the Sunday edition if they haven't put it in already, because it's already been covered quite a bit. And Trump was asked, what is it? What are the criteria? How do you judge these things in order to do these things, invading Venezuela and attacking Venezuela and dropping bombs on Mexico? He wants to drop bombs on Mexico. This is no kidding, guys. He really wants to do all of this stuff. And this is what a malignant narcissist does. And we'll have a really good clip by a psychologist on what malignant narcissists are like. And that'll be later in the show after one of the breaks. And they are chaotic. They are chaotic within themselves, and they sow chaos because it's what they want to do. But he was asked, what is the criteria? And this is what he said: my own morality. That's the only thing that stops me. Nothing else. And I sat there, and I'm sure the interviewer was stunned. I'm sure that many people who have heard that were stunned. If you're hearing that now, if you think for a second, I think you will be stunned also, because consider this, will you? This person, Donald Trump, this illegitimate tenant of the White House right now, and he's using his morality. This is a person who is a 34-time felon. He's been alleged and accused of being a rapist. He once said famously that you should grab women by the pussy, and that if you're famous, they'll let you do it. He wants public executions. He wants people who are above the age of 12 to be able to watch the public executions, and indeed, in fact, that they should watch the public executions. That was actually a Charlie Kirk thing. And good news, the thing that determines whether he's going to do a thing or not, like attack Venezuela, attack Greenland, go to war with Denmark, completely destroy the international rules-based continuum that has governed the world and led to much peace and much coherence and much good feeling and much going along with each other as allies. Good news, folks. It's his morality that's determining all that. Do you understand why Leigh McGowan, politics girl, said she's scared? I think that would scare anybody, aside from the fact that Trump has labeled Leigh McGowan and all journalists, all of the press, enemies of the people. You heard politics girl Leigh McGowan just talk about a recent issuance by Pam Bondi, the corrupt Florida AG General, now the corrupt United States Attorney General, create a situation where basically you can't swing a dead cat without hitting someone who falls under the definition of a domestic terrorist. And these kinds of things are unworkable in a free society. It's not possible to have a free society without the freedom of expression. And reactionary and fascist groups, and I've actually been thrown out of one because I would not cease giving my opinion. And I pointed out that I was chosen and called upon by the station to give my opinion, as I'm doing now. Of course, the show, Politics by Jake, that just short-circuited their brains. They didn't even know how to handle that, and they threw me out of this particular group with no further ado. This is the province and the mindset of fascists. J.D. Vance recently said it's a bunch of radicals in Minnesota, and we can't let that happen. This is the petitioning of the government for redress of grievances. This is the ability to protest, to express ourselves on a subject. This is not radical. This is the Constitution of the United States of America. This is the Bill of Rights, of which freedom of expression, lawful, surely to be true, lawful, freedom of expression is the premier. And thanks to the 14th Amendment, which is the new birth of freedom, originally, and this is interesting too, most people may not have known this, but that was only a federal law. This was the states. It used to be the United States. The United States were state citizenship first. You were a citizen of the state. And secondly, you were a citizen of the United States. The Civil War changed all that because of the 14th Amendment, and there's a whole argument about that. But it made people first citizens of the United States, and it made them second citizens of the state. But what the 14th Amendment did, among other things, is it applied the rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights to the states. So while before the Civil War there may have been an issue as far as freedom of expression is concerned, and let me say that the Britanno-American heritage is full of freedom of expression. So that horse left the barn a long time ago. And yet here we have J.D. Vance calling a bunch of Minnesota radicals, people who are basically just protesting. This is the mindset of the reactionary. This is the mindset of the fascist. This is the mindset of the oligarch. We're going to be talking about that on the show. And as a matter of fact, let's go ahead and let's get into that. I have invented my spleen, enemy of the people that I am, apparently, thanks to Pam Blondie, me and Leigh McGowan, Politics Girl, and Keith Olbermann and Rachel Maddow and other people that you hear on this station, Tom Hartman, Stephanie Miller, so on and so forth, all enemies of the people, all doing the show. And here we are, we'll do the show. And let's take a break before we get into it. Oh, I enjoyed that. Let's take a break and we'll be back. And this is Politics by Jake. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. All right, and this is Politics by Jake, and we are back. And I wanted to share, before we get too far afield, this comment I made at the beginning of the show with regard to malignant narcissism. And I wanted to, you have, as I've talked about, Bandy X. Lee, a clinical psychologist, a Yale graduate, also Mary Trump, the estranged niece of Donald Trump, also a board-certified clinical psychologist, and many others. When we talk about the mental condition of the president on this, and I use that word loosely, of the so-called president, titularly named President of the United States, Donald Trump, we talk about the mental illness, we talk about his unfitness, and you're seeing it, and it's being reported by myself and by my colleagues continually. This man is unfit for any job, state or federal. According to the 14th Amendment, Section 3, he shouldn't even be able to run for an office, either state or federal. And we've talked about that on the show, and I'm not going to go, other than saying it, I'm not going to go into it and explain why. You can listen to various shows, and we'll undoubtedly talk about it again as well. But he is not fit. He is not mentally fit. He is mentally ill. He is a malignant narcissist. And he probably has other conditions also. Hypomania is one that has been mentioned. And because there's so much going on, because so many of my colleagues are out there in the media talking about these things on this show, I want to bring these to your attention as they come to my attention. And here's one. And we have another certified psychologist talking about malignant narcissism in general and what kinds of people these are and the kinds of things that they struggle with and that go on continually in their minds and the torment and the hell that they are actually in and that they inflict upon people if they are allowed into public office. And here we go.
Narcissists are miserable.
They're miserable. Miserable. I actually say that the compassion we can find in ourselves is people are like, I want to get revenge on them. I say, you don't have to. They have to keep being them.
They have to live with it.
The universe wins on that one. Like, they have to keep being them. Imagine every day you're comparing yourself to everyone. You're thinking, they have that and they have that. How come I don't have this and how come this? And they're constantly anxious. They're constantly angry. They constantly feel like a victim. They feel like everyone is out to get them. That's a very difficult way to live.
Their nervous system must be always heightened, too.
Kind of. Yeah, different than their psychopathic cousins there. It's an uncomfortable way to live. They always feel like they're getting the short end of the stick.
All right, and that is from an interview by another colleague, Lewis Howes, and he's available at youtube.com/user/Lewis Howes !sub_confirmation =1. But just go to YouTube and type in Lewis Howes, Lewis Howes, Howes. And he does a lot of interviews there. He's got a lot of clips, just like I do at Politics by Jake. And here he is talking, and you just heard it, talking with regard to a guest about what a malignant narcissist is. And it's very interesting. And you will notice what the guest says about how they always feel deprived of something. They always want this. They always want this. Trump wants to put his name on everything. He wants to put his name on everything. And this is pathological, mind you. I do have a minor in psychology in my undergraduate degree, which I've been told is just enough to get me in a lot of trouble, but I'm going to do it anyway because I think I am standing on firm ground based on those who have graduate degrees and who are board certified. I'm basically following what they say here, and I'm talking about the fact that there is an empty pit, a huge, giant, empty black pit, a black hole of neediness that can never be filled. This is pathological. This is mental illness. A person who has this kind of a situation is mentally ill. And what do you hear Donald Trump say so very often? It's so unfair. It's very unfair to me. And that's why he does it. He'll never get rid of it. He needs help. He needs therapy, and he needs to be impeached out of the office of presidency of the United States and go spend time with his family and get help because that's what he needs. So, all right, I want to step back now. And I often talk about how we talk about symptoms, and I've been talking a lot about things that are symptoms, but there's a question beneath the noise, and I want to step back and I want to deal with something that sits underneath almost everything else, because that's what Politics by Jake talks about the kinds of causes that bring about these symptoms. And what I want to do now is spend a little time talking about the matter of class and class struggle. And I'm really glad, by the way, to be talking about this. This is some very interesting stuff. Welcome to the show. I hope that you are compelled by some of the things that I am about to tell you about, because in my opinion, they are very compelling and they are very needful for we as responsible American citizenry to be aware of. And I do this not as an insult. We're not going to talk about it as an insult, like someone has a lack of class, not as an ideology, but as a structural fact of political life. And this is one that Americans are trained very deliberately not to see. Because once you understand class, an enormous amount of what looks on the surface to be chaotic suddenly becomes legible and intelligible, including the central riddle of our time that we've been talking about in the first part of the show and moving into the next two, like almost a segment and a half of the show. How did working people in the United States come to believe sufficiently to elect him that, and this is arguable too, but just for the sake of the argument, arguendo, as the Romans would say, how did working people in the United States come to believe that a billionaire real estate speculator, Donald Trump, was their champion, and that he saw them, that he understood them, and was fighting on their behalf? that belief just wasn't mistaken. In many cases, it was catastrophic, and it only makes sense in a society where class consciousness and an understanding of class struggle and the fundaments and the rudiments of that has been systematically erased. So, okay, we're going to be talking about that. Now, class didn't start with Marx. It begins with Plato. Class analysis does not begin with Marx. You know, Karl Marx, Das Kapital, the Communist Manifesto. It begins with Plato. Plato was writing in the Republic in the early 4th century BC. This is roughly 380 to 370 BC. And Plato explains that forms of government are defined by who rules. And in several of these forms, it is not an individual, but a class. And oligarchy in particular is ruled by the rich. Plato, this is a class, the oligarchic class, the moneyed class, okay? Oligarchy is ruled by the rich. Plato defines it in this way. He says it's a constitution in which the rich rule and the poor have no share in power. And he adds something that modern readers often miss. Every regime produces a human type. This is why I spent time at the beginning of the show sharing with you about Donald Trump, because Plato said that oligarchy produces something that you could call the oligarchic man. He is hoarding. He is secretive. He is contemptuous of law. He is indulgent with the money of others. He is hostile to restraint and to reason. And again, that's not Karl Marx. That's not Lenin. That's not Stalin. That's not Trotsky. That's Plato. 24 centuries ago. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. Now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake, and we're back. And we're talking about class, the topic of class and class struggle in the United States, and how to understand, because, you know, if you don't know who the enemy is, they're going to be able to have their way with you. And one of the things that we're talking about here, which in the United States, I mean, class, the idea of class and the idea of class struggle is treated as boorish, impolite, imaginary, irrelevant, unworthy of serious consideration as a topic, because we're all supposed to be equal. We're all supposed to be Americans, right? Well, this didn't happen by accident. It's the product of decades of conditioning by wealth, first millionaires, then billionaires, replacing class with identity, with culture, with spectacle, with grievance, and endless distractions. The Roman had a saying for this: bread and circuses. Distract the masses. Distract the plebeians. Distract who were the ordinary common people in Rome. The mob, as they were called. Because if you didn't distract the mob, you had trouble. So bread and circuses, entertainments. Make sure they had enough food. There was even an office of that. It was called the prefect of the grain. The grain dole was crucial to controlling the people in Rome. This is how it was done. Once class disappears from analysis, and it has, and I'm trying to bring it back right now. We're talking about it right now. Political judgment collapses because that's how working people come to identify with billionaires. This is how Trump works. Not because he represents working people, but because class misrecognition has become, and actually not merely class recognition, but the refusal to acknowledge the issue of class and class struggle has become normal. And Trump is mentally ill. He talks to resentment because he's full of resentment. Carl Jung used to talk about this. He used to talk about collective psychosis. He used to talk about the wounded leader, someone who is wounded like Trump, and Trump is definitely wounded when he realized, according to his niece Mary at the age of 5, that he was never going to be loved. This incredible wellspring, a never-ending, bottomless pit of resentment and of hurt and of pain. And so, yeah, it's so unfair, right? Isn't that what Donald Trump always says? So he speaks to this resentment because that's where he lives. He lives in a bottomless pit of resentment. If he wasn't doing so much damage to the entire world, as I and my colleagues have been trying to point out since 2015 on this show and others, it would be tragic. It would be Shakespearean. It would be pathetic. We would feel sorry for such a person, but he speaks to resentment. He speaks of the wound. And those who have been wounded, and we've talked about this, we'll talk about this a little bit, and we'll try to explain just very briefly how people have been wounded. We've talked about this on the show before, but he speaks to the resentment in other people, and they respond to him. This is the classic collective psychosis, where the wounded leader speaks to the wounded, and he is working for ownership of them. And Hollywood has been trying to tell us this. I know, Hollywood, can you believe it? But it's true. This is something Americans don't like to admit. I'm not even sure that they know it, that they realize it. But Hollywood has been trying to warn us about this for a very long time, not necessarily the Jungian psychosis, collective psychosis, wounded leader, wounded followers thing, but they've been trying to warn us about the dangers of class and the recognition of class struggle for a long time. Not perfectly, God knows, not consistently, but persistently. And if I would venture an opinion, and I know many people listen to the show, many people in the United States are religious, so it would not be so untoward if I venture an opinion about God. Although I've been, as I say, I've been thrown out of better places than this for just venturing such opinion, but I will. Just this one time. I'm a man of science. Typically on this show, we don't talk about this. But if I were to venture an opinion, I would say that if there is a God, he speaks to the people of the United States and to the world. And one of the ways he does so is through Hollywood. I know, wild, huh? Sometimes clearly, sometimes indirectly, and sometimes despite Hollywood itself. Look at Frank Capra, famous film producer and director. Capra's films, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Meet John Doe, It's a Wonderful Life. These are classic Hollywood films. Classic. They're not naive fairy tales. What they are is anti-oligarchic parables. They show money, power, corrupting institutions, ordinary people manipulated and discarded, and the constant struggle between decency and concentrated power. Capra understood something essential. America survives only when ordinary people recognize their moral and political weight. Hollywood's been telling that story for decades. We just keep changing the channel. There are many other such movies. The Wizard of Oz is an example of that. Many people have pointed to The Wizard of Oz and the messages in it. Follow the yellow brick road. That's gold. Follow the gold to see who's in control, to see who's in power. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Someone is trying to tell you something. Okay. Let's continue on this. The moral universe of the rich. Fitzgerald, F. Scott Fitzgerald saw this. F. Scott Fitzgerald, he's a Princeton-educated chronicler of wealth and status. He was fascinated with it. He saw and he understood something that Ernest Hemingway did not. Fitzgerald was socially acute. He was obsessed with the issues of money and hierarchy. And he said this in his novel, The Great Gatsby. The rich are different from you and me. And Ernest Hemingway is a similarly famous and esteemed writer of the time, a reductionist, macho, dismissive of social analysis. He replied, he said, yeah, the rich are different from you and me. They have more money. Clever. That's clever. Wrong. I'm sorry. I got a little excited there. But it's wrong. What Fitzgerald was trying to describe was the fact that the rich inhabit a different moral universe. These are people who hurt others without thinking. They don't feel consequences. They assume superiority is a birthright. Plato, he would have recognized them instantly. So class is not just economics, it's psychology. And at this point, let's take another break. And this is Politics by Jake, and we will be right back with more. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. All right. Thank you, Twain Consulting. This is Politics by Jake, and we are back, and we're talking about class. And let's talk about when class pressure breaks. Let's talk about the Weimar Republic and Italy. In Germany, after World War I, the empire collapsed, and something called the Weimar Republic is born. And at this point where we're going to be talking about, it's only weeks old, and it is. It's a republic. And in fact, it only lasted 14 years, and some people have argued that the reason why it only lasted 14 years is because it was hyper-democratic, which we're not in favor of. In other words, it bent over backwards to make sure that everybody had a voice. So in other words, in the way this worked out, if you could get in a district, if you could get 60,000 votes, you were able to get a seat in the parliament of the Weimar Republic. So a lot of people could be in the republic and they could speak, but this was despised. It was fragile, despised by the elites who felt dispossessed, and they were dispossessed. And enter at this time a man named Wolfgang Kapp, K-A-P-P. Kapp was a reactionary bureaucrat. He was tied to landed and nationalist interests, which had recently been dispossessed of empire. And another politician, it was actually a general, the military guy, Walther von Lüttwitz, And Ludwig was a Prussian general. He was furious at the dismantling of the Freikorps, which is the Free Corps. And in March 1920, they got together and they launched something that has been called the Cap Putsch. And the Cap Putsch was an elite attempt to strangle democracy in its crib. And like I say, what we're talking about is the Weimar Republic. And the army refused to defend the Republic. And the government fled Berlin. And so, on paper, the coup should have succeeded. This was really working out. At the same time in Italy, you have a situation where workers and peasants, they were promised land for fighting the war, and they came home and they wanted the government to, pony up. Hey, you said that we would have land. We want the land. Landowners refused. And the state sided with property. Workers occupied the land. Elite backed fascist squadristi. Not because fascism was inevitable, but because it was useful. And this is something to always understand about the rich, the moneyed class. They will use you because you are useful, not because they agree. This is class war from above. Now, at about this time, I've been wanting to talk on the show about this person for a long time. She's a person who is not known generally in history. When I say her name, you will not know her. Now, someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I'll bet if I said the name Rosa Luxemburg, she would know her, and she would esteem her as I do. And now we come to her because this is the time in which she lived and fought and died. And we have to talk about her because of what she did and because of what happened to her. We see how the money power, how oligarchy reveals itself when someone comes along and reveals it. And this must be done. It must be done fully. And it must be done honestly. Rosa Luxemburg was not a thug. She was not a demagogue. She was not a fanatic. She was a Polish-born Jewish intellectual, one of the most brilliant economists of her generation. And she was a co-founder of the Spartacus League. She was a democratic socialist. She was a fierce opponent of militarism. She was a relentless critic of authoritarianism from any direction. She openly criticized Lenin. She was no communist. She rejected party dictatorship. She rejected terror. Her core belief was simple, and it was simple and devastating. Freedom, she said, is above all, and this is the baseline, always the freedom of the one who thinks differently. The freedom of people who think the same, that's, comparatively not a very big thing. But where the rubber meets the road is when you have one who thinks differently. And she was operating at the very birth of the Weimar Republic. Like I said, we couldn't have been more than 3 months old. So it would be right to say 3 months, that'd be 12 weeks. So it was already under assault. And she never lived long enough to see whether socialism could evolve into the hybrid democratic system integrated with law, institutions, and a strong middle class. She never lived to see it. And I'm going to tell you what happened to her, because what was done to her matters. And you need to listen to it. And you need to be aware of it, because this is where the money power reveals itself. This is where rich men reveal their true nature. This is where oligarchy, like Plato, this is where the oligarchic man appears. And this is what he is. And this is what he does. Because of what she does, she was arrested by forces aligned with the old order. And she was not merely arrested. She was beaten. She was mocked. She was humiliated. And after they did that, she was not shot, not executed clinically. She was machine gunned. Machine gunned. and her body was dumped into the Landwehr Canal, just like garbage. That was not chaos. That was purposeful, and it was vile, and it was abuse. And that hatred, that venom, that bile, that tells you something essential. This is how oligarchy really feels about those who expose it with clarity. Not fear, not debate, but contempt. Contempt and vile hatred of the most disgusting and depraved kind. Rosa Luxemburg, and this is the conclusion to be drawn from all this, she wasn't dangerous because she was violent. She was dangerous because she was rational, moral, and democratic. And oligarchy? Oligarchy can't tolerate that. And here's the part. Here's the part they hope you never connect to Rosa Luxemburg. The Cap Putsch did not collapse. That's right. We're back to the Cap Putsch. It did not collapse because elite changed their minds and said, oh, we're going to they're not so bad after all. We're going to let them up and have no, that didn't happen. The Cap Putsch didn't collapse because elites changed their minds. It collapsed because workers shut the country down. A general strike. The railways stopped. The trains stopped. Power stopped. Water stopped. Industry stopped. Finance stopped. Berlin went dark for 4 days. And in that 4 days, the coup collapsed. No civil war. No civil war. No terror. Just withdrawn consent. This is exactly what Rosa Luxemburg believed in. The power of mass, rational, nonviolent power. And that is why she was murdered, before it could become the norm. And this is Politics by Jake, and we'll be back. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake, and we are back. And I want to go on, and I want to talk. We talked about Hollywood a bit. We talked about Frank Capra. There were others like Frank Capra. And I want to talk about something that's history, but which was memorialized, dramatized. It was dramatized also, but it was memorialized in a very well-known film called Gangs of New York, which was directed by Martin Scorsese. And this is where Martin Scorsese enters the story with Gangs of New York. Remember how I ventured the radical opinion that if God speaks, and I do believe that God speaks in a myriad of ways, he speaks through Hollywood. Okay, so let's get the idea behind this, shall we? The film is set in the mid-19th century New York. At this time, it's a city exploding with mass Irish immigration, brutal urban poverty, native violence, or I should say nativist violence, political machines like Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed. Do you remember Boss Tweed? That's the guy. This is the time that he was operating. And the ruling class thrives while gangs fight each other. And in the film, you have the hero. And the hero is named Amsterdam Valland. And he's played by Leonardo DiCaprio. And he's standing at the docks, and he's experiencing the brutal urban poverty. He's experiencing the gangs fighting with one against another. And having experienced this, he is standing at the docks, and he's watching this Irish immigrants pour off the ships. And they're hungry, and they're disoriented, and they're disposable. At least in the eyes of power, they're disposable. And it hits him. That's the real army. Not knives, not gangs, not theatrics, but the people. Once the people recognize themselves, and Scorsese is showing the same truth that Capra showed, the same truth that Rosa believed, the same truth that the general strike proved. Power doesn't fear violence. Power fears recognition. It fears being called out for what it really is. And that brings us to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, as you've heard him mentioned, probably the greatest president. I don't know. I think you would have to say the greatest president of the 20th century. And one, you could call him, and I have called him on other shows, a founder, because he founded a new America that came out of the Depression. And he practiced something called populism. And there are basically two kinds, real and fake. That may seem a little easy for me to make that distinction. There are two kinds of populism. One is real and the other is fake. One is economic populism and the other is false population. And he named concentrated financial power, the money class oligarchy, as the enemy. And he built a hybrid system of regulated capitalism, strong institutions, labor protection, and a thriving middle class. And this was the thing that made America the great power that it truly became. This was what defeated fascism. This is what defeated emperors in Japan. This is what created the strongest middle class, the greatest growth in American history. This is what sent a man to the moon. This is what made the middle class preeminent in society until 2015, which is about the time when Trump comes along. And remember this, Roosevelt wasn't rich. You know, there's a saying that only Nixon could go to China. And why? Because Nixon was a rabid anti-communist. And so there was a particular credibility of him acknowledging communism by going to China and meeting with Mao Zedong. Similarly, remember this, Roosevelt was rich. Roosevelt was the very kind of person that Fitzgerald wrote about. And his own class despised him because of what he did. They called him a traitor. They accused him of destroying civilization. Why? Because he threatened oligarchy. And by contrast, a false populism, it redirects anger sideways. Culture, grievance, identity, and it leaves ownership untouched. Oligarchs don't fear that. They use it. So in closing, here's the truth we have to sit with. This is the same game. When I was doing research on my book, I realized that the game is always the same. It has always been the same games. Sure, the names change, the uniforms change, the numbers change, the technology changes, but the structure, The structure does not change. Plato saw this, and he named it. Frank Capra warned us that money, power, corrodes democracy, and that ordinary people matter only when they recognize themselves as such and the great power that they hold. And upon this, my listeners and viewers, those of you who are on YouTube, everything depends now. Politics girl Leigh McGowan despairs whether the system can be saved. I have said if it is going to be saved, the institutions will have to save it. They will have to hold. And ordinary people like you, like me, like Leigh, matter. And we need to recognize ourselves as such, and we need to recognize our power. Fitzgerald explained what the rich are really like. Rosa Luxemburg knew that. She paid for her clarity with purposeful, sadistic violence. Because the oligarchic man does not debate those who expose them. It degrades them in order to send a message. The general strike of the cap putsch that destroyed the cap putsch proved that none of this is inevitable, that when people withdraw consent together, even an elite-backed coup collapses. You're seeing this now in Donald Trump. People say, oh, Trump is strong. He's weaker than he's ever been. Unfortunately, it'll take another show to talk about that because we're almost out of time. Scorsese in Gangs of New York showed us the same truth in another key. The real army is not gangs or weapons, but it's people who haven't yet realized their power. And Roosevelt showed for a time that a hybrid system could hold the line until it was corrupted. We have been warned over and over again. So why does it keep working? Because the power of money has learned something. It doesn't need to suppress memory openly. It just needs to distract. Divide people by culture instead of class, turn politics into a spectacle, turn rage into identity, turn history into trivia, turn truth into just another opinion, and slowly, with bread and with entertainments and circuses, people forget. And that forgetting is not accidental. It's the strategy. And here's the warning, plainly stated. Nothing that is happening now is new. What's new is how much we have been encouraged to forget. How much we have forgotten. If the people don't remember Rosa, they won't recognize the contempt and the vileness. If they don't remember the general strike, they won't believe collective action works. If they don't remember Roosevelt, they'll think any challenge to money is extreme. Like J.D. Vance said, a bunch of Minnesota radicals. If they don't remember Capra, they'll think that decency is naive. If they don't remember Plato, they won't even have the language to name what's ruling them. Class consciousness is not rage. It's memory. And the moment people remember, really remember what the game is that is being played and how it always ends, the spell breaks. Because oligarchy can survive anger. What it cannot survive is recognition. Remember, they win when we forget. They panic when we remember. And this is Politics by Jake.